Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Aggregate, the podcast that turns the news into numbers, the numbers into bets, and the bets into arguments. Today, it is Wednesday, the 22nd of April, and we are going to be discussing the fate of Keir Starmer, among other crucial questions. But before we get into it, let's meet the members of the podcast.
I'm Ben. I'm a material scientist in the US and a pro forecaster.
I'm Jan. I'm a lawyer in Canada, and I'm a pro forecaster on many platforms.
I'm Nicolas, aka 44 not found on many forecasting platforms, and I'm a super forecaster.
Hard to imagine a better group of people to discuss such a complicated question. But before we get into the details of how we might want to forecast such a question, such as when will Keir Starmer no longer be the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, or will he be the Prime Minister on December 31st, I think it's worth understanding a little bit of the history around the current scandal and why it's such a big deal. Because Peter Mandelson was an ambassador. There are many ambassadors. It's not necessarily clear why this scandal in particular will bring Keir Starmer down. But Peter Mandelson has a very specific psychosocial role within the British Labour Party, and he's been around much, much longer than most members of the party, most leaders of the party. His sort of story with the party goes back to the 1980s, when the Labour Party was sort of absolutely on its knees. It was during the era of Margaret Thatcher, where lots of people had essentially written off the Labour Party. There was a challenger party called the Social Democrat Party, which had taken lots of the vote away from Labour. And after the 1983 election, many people, including many senior Labour politicians, thought the party was basically finished. One person who didn't was Peter Mandelson, who at the time was a young television producer, and he became very, very close to the new leader of the Labour Party, a man called Neil Kinnock. And together they essentially embarked upon a process of reinvention of the Labour Party, which, while it didn't work for Neil Kinnock, did eventually work for one of his successors, Tony Blair, who also relied on Peter Mandelson, and eventually they won a stunning victory and then a series of stunning victories after that. However, Peter Mandelson has always been dogged by claims that he is the prince of dark arts, and that he often uses the media to attack his opponents, as well as being personally quite corrupt. And he sort of became an MP under New Labour, but was almost immediately embroiled in enormous personal corruption scandals to do with payments for homes. These have always continued with him in whatever role he's had, but nevertheless, many Labour leaders have ended up relying on him. The closest US analogy may be Clark Clifford, who famously was very important for many Democratic presidents, and who Jimmy Carter declared, if you see us relying on Clark Clifford, you'll know we have failed. And nevertheless, Jimmy Carter ended up relying on Clark Clifford, and he did indeed lose the 1980 election. And Peter Mandelson has sort of played this role for Keir Starmer, kind of in sort of his darkest hour after he sort of, when he came to power, didn't quite know how to deal with Donald Trump, who was once again became the US president, and he needed someone who was regarded as being very, very savvy, very able to deal with sort of these difficult personalities. However, the scandals that dogged Peter Mandelson came with him, and the current scandal is about whether the fact that these scandals were all essentially public knowledge at every stage, how on earth did he come to be vetted and approved as US ambassador? And in the process that led to this, was Keir Starmer personally involved in anything that overrode a security vetting? Did he then lie to Parliament about what had happened when this originally occurred? And to what extent has he essentially hidden behind other people and tried to sort of shirk responsibility? So that's kind of the root of the current scandal. Of course, as these things often do, it's taken on a life of its own. And it's no longer even really about the initial substance. It's about the cover-up of the cover-up and arguments about who said what after the scandal had broken. And that's sort of where we find ourselves today. So that's sort of some background to the current scandal. But some of the questions we're really interested in are how much longer does Starmer have as Prime Minister? And what are his chances of ending the year as Prime Minister? Currently, the markets are sort of pricing against that. That's true in poly market. That's true in lots of the more traditional betting markets. So how can we think about this now that we know some of the context? Jan, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so I'm not following extremely closely UK politics, but since I'm French, I have a good sense of what's happening there. I think in the same way that they have a good sense of what's happening in France. Basically, in this case, I think that Starmer is likely telling the truth, although it seems far-fetched that it didn't know. But from what I gather, the way all of the steps have been made, it looks like they were actually made to create that kind of situation where the actual leaders are protected from any knowledge that would be bad for them, and therefore they could make bad decisions in a way without knowing that they are. And it seems that there was some lower level person implicated in so I'm not sure if it was in labor or directly the government, who basically took the blame for all of this and is saying that is been like there's been some push from the government, but he was the only one to actually take the decision. That sounds weird, but the more I read about it, the more it seems to actually have some real ground to it. But even if that is true, I think this is one more blow to Starmer. He's already been in a very bad state for a few months, if not a year and a half, maybe even. At the beginning of the year, in the ACX, there was, and others could say what their forecast was on that. There was a forecast on whether he would remain prime minister this year. I think I was at 60% that he would not, pretty much against a lot against the community. And this only makes me believe even more that he's not going to last very long. Poly market is maybe a bit high on short term. I had a look at it the other day, but it doesn't look crazy either. By the end of the year, I mean, at this point, it seems pretty much sealed to me that he's going to get out. Basically, now the question is whether he will move out on his own. Well, at least to me, it's whether he will move out on his own or whether the party will turn on him. The issue is that there's pretty much no one to actually take place after him, from what I understand. Like everyone either has terrible background or no charisma. So if it ends up that he remains there, it's most likely because no one will actually be able to take the lead after him, which is saying a lot about the state of Labour. I guess maybe even about the politics in the UK. But yeah, that's my main reasoning around this, and I think it's likely that in the following months you will just move out. I don't expect the elections to go well. I don't think anyone expect the elections to go well. So yeah, that will be one more thing to add to his baggage, and he won't be there for long, I think.
I think a lot of what you say is very true. And I think one other interesting point is that a lot of Starmer's reputation was based on the idea that he was this ultra competent civil servant. So he was formerly director of public prosecution, sort of like an attorney general figure, very concerned with sort of like proper behavior and proper process. And the way that he's now basically pointing at this senior civil servant and saying like it's all his fault seems quite undermining to a lot of what sort of built his kind of political career. And I think it's also true that there's a lot of concern about like this lack of talent after him, like what comes next. And the Labour Party itself is like very, very divided here. And whereas a lot of previous sort of occasions when they've been at this kind of point where you have a leader who's got to go, so sort of late era Blair or sort of after Miliband, there were clear party factions who sort of had champions who were kind of ready to come forward. And so that meant there was a lot more sort of, I guess, militating in favour of sort of relatively early leadership elections because there were all these people chomping at the bit. Whereas, as you say, this time it's quite different. It feels like there's much more of a vacuum, and sort of the likely ministers who could theoretically become prime minister aren't really heads of factions in quite the same way, and the lines seem quite different. And yeah, the other thing is that for the first time ever, you have this like very big challenge to Labour from the left, with both the Greens, who are now sort of like surging in the polls, and a bunch of different independents and some of sort of their traditional urban cores, and that will make them the party much more skeptical of kind of a leadership challenge. But then this raises the question of if he can't go on and he can't go, what are you going to do? So like a lot of governments have, sort of tried to do this kind of internal reform thing where basically it's sort of at the midpoint you say, we've done the difficult reforms of the first half, we're now sort of pivoting to the fun times, and things sort of will get better from here. That seems like a much tougher sell at this point. And I guess it's not totally clear what they can kind of bring. So I think one potential question when considering whether or not he'll be here by the end of the year is which sort of faction or sort of which senior minister has the best possible chance of constructing some kind of future vision and saying, there's not just a vacuum here. I've actually got a plan for what comes after Starmer, and then taking that to the MPs and convincing them. Because one thing the Labour Party doesn't have, like the Conservative Party, is they have no equivalent of what the Conservative Party's, I guess, sort of like MP representation board is called, something called the 1922 Committee, which basically offers a system for relatively speedy executions of unpopular prime ministers. That doesn't exist in the Labour Party. For there to be a challenge that's sort of not endorsed by the leadership, as challenges tend not to be, there's no kind of formal way to do a vote of no confidence. So when they last tried this in 2016 with Corbyn, it was basically a complete catastrophe because there's no such thing as a vote of no confidence in the Labour Party, and it sort of became this like sort of disaster that rolled on and on and on. And so they're not going to do that again. So if something does happen, it will basically have to be managed. It might have to be a little bit stage managed. But yeah, I think, as you say, sort of the focus is on sort of the 3 or 4 ministers who could theoretically become prime minister and what exactly they can offer the members.
It's something that is really that always surprises me. The fact that the country is actually more under a party than under someone. When the Conservatives were in power, it was kind of the same. I was always surprised that it was actually 50 people behind closed doors who were deciding who was going to be the next leader, and that for like the next 7 to 8 years, because there's no general election until 2026. So too bad. That is really a surprising way to work. I'm curious, for the others. Did you have a forecast? I don't know if you participated in ACX. Did you have a forecast on that? And what is currently your forecast on Keir Starmer staying? I saw Ben surprised when I say it was pretty much sealed earlier. Currently, I'm at about 80% that by the end of the year it won't be there. Maybe pretty much sealed was a bit strong. Well,
Yeah. So at the time, at the start of the year when the ACX contest was initiated, it looks like I was at 38% that he would cease to be PM by the end of the year. The aggregated forecast for across the tournament was 35%. So I was like a little bit above that. But at that time, betting markets had him at more like almost 50%, I think, to be out by the end of the year. And I thought that was high. Obviously, a lot has happened since then. But a couple things were surprising to me. First of all, by U.S. standards, this scandal is like a nothing burger. So you have so Starmer appointed this guy to be ambassador. Sure, ambassador to the U.S., but like in the U.S., ambassador positions are like nothing. And I doubt even the president really thinks about these ambassador appointments much. Plus, you don't want like a goody two shoes ambassador. You want someone who is going to be like able to suck up to, or do some sort of corrupt things to extract what you want out of another nation. I'm trying to think of I guess Dennis Rodman is not an official ambassador to North Korea for the U.S., but at various points he's I think served in some sort of quasi-governmental role as like a cultural ambassador to that country. I'm sure the intelligence community has been reaching out to Dennis Rodman about this. And I mean, Rodman's not he hasn't done anything bad. He's not like Peter Mandelson, but he's certainly like a flamboyant figure who doesn't necessarily, maybe voters wouldn't be like, why did you appoint that, right? So if he had been appointed as North Korean ambassador, maybe the U.S. would have been the public would have been unhappy with this, but it would have certainly been the right choice to make, even if Rodman had done very bad things, because it was like the best shot the U.S. had at entering into some sort of into talks with North Korea, perhaps, is through this cultural figure that they appreciate. And so Mandelson has had this relationship with Trump. I mean, Trump had his relationship with Epstein as well, as is well documented. Seems like a good choice for the UK. So it's just strange that the UK public has reacted so negatively. It's not like there's any allegations that Mandelson did wrongdoing. He didn't participate in any of Epstein's things, perhaps. And then he's now been arrested for sending emails to Epstein. But as far as I can tell, this is a politically pursued prosecution. These emails seem like not really something you really care if these are being sent to. I mean, maybe it's kind of Hillary Clinton level. Oh, the emails weren't managed properly and shouldn't have been sent. But again, this doesn't seem like a nationwide scandal that would bring down a prime minister. that's what's surprising to me. And but the public will react in ways the public wants to react.
Yeah, I certainly agree with Ben, and as I'm from Italy, so I'm kind of used to all kinds of sexual scandals and sexual misconducts of our own prime ministers. So not people appointed by the prime ministers, but proper prime minister, because we had like Berlusconi, who in 2010 was there was an allegation that basically there was some kind of underage prostitutes ring or something, and basically one of those girls ended up in police custody, and through some a series of phone calls, it was asked to free this girl from police custody because she was like the parent of some kind of major African leader, which was absolutely not true. And if the Berlusconi government survived that kind of situation, I'm thinking of the contrast with this kind of situation here. So it might be due to the fact that probably the Labour Party has some kind of different ethical I don't know how to say it, but some principles that are different
Standards.
from those of other parties. Some standards that are tighter, and also like 15 years have passed since Berlusconi, so it's a completely different world we live in. But I think it's interesting to notice this type of contrast. And I want to add that something that really strikes me. So I did not participate in the ACX this year, and uh, I didn't make still a proper forecast about the future of Starmer, but it's sort of surprising to me that people at the beginning of the year were assigning over a 50% chance that he would be removed or resign or something, because whenever there's something of this size that is like more than 50% likely to happen, or it is expected to have such a high probability to happen, then it sort of becomes something meta, because it's like this Damocles swords on his head, and if that's something that's going to happen anyway, then maybe there's some political process that would start moving due to the existence of that very forecast. So if the expectation is that the government will fall, it should either fall soon or not fall at all. So the fact that 4 months removed from that initial forecast in January, we are still seeing about 60% chance he will leave by June, July, whatever months we want to say. It's weird, because the way I interpret it is that probably the Labour Party, as Joshua earlier said, and as Jan said, has no alternative to Starmer. So there's no like factions that could promote a new leader and try to put someone else in power as a substitute to Starmer.
So I think there's a lot of truth in what you say, but there is one exception, which is there is a former Labour leader who is currently a minister. That's Ed Miliband, who some of our listeners may have heard of, who's currently serving as sort of Minister for Energy. And I mean, so he did a television interview, I believe, yesterday, where basically sort of halfway through the interview, he essentially almost stops trying to defend Starmer and just kind of starts agreeing with the interviewer that, like, yeah, this is really bad. And one could imagine that he might be some sort of like interim leader who is seen as sort of a safe pair of hands. While he did stop being leader, he stopped being leader because he lost an election. There wasn't sort of a scandal in the same way. Now, of course, maybe incompetence and failure is its own kind of scandal, but that's obviously very different to sort of like corruption or impropriety. I also want to very quickly go back to something that Ben said on the sort of like the Peter Mandelson would have been like a good ambassador, because like you need someone to sort of deal with kind of like this harsh world of Washington. I think that's very true, and I think the fact that that was the sort of explicit reasoning behind it at the time makes the current sort of fiasco even worse. To sort of borrow a French phrase, it's worse than a crime, it's a mistake. Right, in that Mandelson didn't actually get anything, right? Like nothing good came of it. It looked like there might be some tariff relief early on, and then it turned out that was all basically fake anyway, and it was all sort of subsumed in like global tariffs. And I think that there's a real sense that like Starmer took this big risk and it failed. And like in some ways the scandal's about the content, but in some ways it's about the failure of the gamble itself. And so it's sort of like, had he pulled off the things that he sort of wanted to, then maybe we'd be looking at a very sort of different situation.
So on 2 points, going back to Nicolos, one of the reasons I think why this has not happened yet on Starmer is that the Labour was waiting for the elections to go bad, because they basically knew that they were going to get trashed in the elections. So might as well wait, and after the elections say, oh, the elections were so bad, we need a new leader. Whereas if you change too early and the new leader is destroyed during the elections, then you might be in even more trouble than you were before, because your new leader has now no grounding, and that makes the situation even worse. So I think starting from like June, July, we may see things changes. And to Ben's point on the administrator, I think that today, well, one thing is that the labor is the left, and so they apply higher standards, I would say, to themselves on such things, because the militants are clearly on very hard on that stuff. And overall, the public knows more and cares more about that kind of stuff. And even if they don't care, if it's the enemy who is doing something bad, they will act like they care. I think that's part of the reasons, because yeah, it seems to be a lot of noise for some stuff, but not that bad considering the situation. I don't know.
So I take your point about the interval of time between when the first predictions that summer would fall were made to the fact that there are going to be elections soon. And I think that this time window is very important, and it's meaningful because probably if there's an optimal distance between the scandal and the elections that would have allowed factions within the party to break away in a way that would have saved maybe or at least in part the some of the elections. I would expect some local leaders or people from parties that are affiliated at a local level or whatever to try to break away from the falling leader to say, look, I'm completely different, I'm doing something else, I'm not interested in staying with them, I have different ideas. But probably that kind of behavior was not possible just specifically because the time window, because the election was too close. So if I understand correctly, that's what you're saying, that maybe if there was more time to the elections, they would have acted earlier to remove Starmer, but now it's just these 6 months, so it's not possible to change strategy that late.
Yeah, that sounds about right, and that's why I expected like no meaningful change until May. Well, I'm not sure the date anymore. It's end of May, I think. Anyway, around that time, but we should see, like, if nothing happens in, like, let's say August, by then I will start moving lower, like meaningfully. But until then, I think it's fine to remain pretty high. And I think that's actually an interesting point that we've been talking about forecasting wise for our listeners. You have to get the timeline clear. Sometimes there will be an event that will make it so that you should not update until that event. But as soon as that event has happened, you should update strongly, or at least very regularly. And sometimes we see that in forecasts where there's okay, let's say I have a good example. You're waiting for financial results of a company. Basically, you forecast 2 months ahead. There will not be a lot to change by the time the financial results are reported, because pretty much everything is already in. Whereas if you're forecasting, I don't know how many, if a certain amount of boats will go through the Strait of Hormuz in a week, every day you should update upwards or downwards, depending on how many there were in the day.
Yeah, I've since updated my forecast to about 2/3 on Metaculus. I think there's still one factor that should be making us skeptical that it's like a guarantee at this point, and that's it just seems like a really bad political play for Labor to do this after the elections versus in like a year or two. If they're going to replace their leader, they might want it to happen closer to the next relevant thing that they're trying to get public support for, or perhaps closer to the elections that are in, 4 years from now? When are the next major elections for Labour?
So also the last possible date for the next elections
Yeah.
is July 2029.
Yeah. So if you want to, replace your party leader with a younger, more popular, fresher face or something, why not do that in 2028? And let Starmer kind of, survive as long as possible, so that you don't have to waste your political capital replacing leaders 2 or 3 more times before the election. And given the rate of leadership replacement in the UK over the last couple of years, that who's to say that the next leader won't have some equivalently minor scandal and have to get replaced again? Why do it now? So it looks like
Yeah, but what is Starmer's current polling?
terrible.
It's like 15%, something like that. So at this point, that's reason enough maybe to just.
But why burn through 2 more leaders in the next 3 years? Get them down to 15% too. Keep replacing them. Like, what's the advantage in replacing Starmer with somebody else?
Well, I guess the theory of replacement wouldn't be that's not what you're doing. The risk of staying, I think, is the same risk of leaving a dead body in a bed, which is that you'll get maggots and disease. So you have the Greens and the Independents sort of eating away at Labour. If there's a sense that there's no momentum, that's likely to happen much, much faster. And then if you start to see MP defections to the Greens in the same way you've seen MP defections from the Conservatives to Reform, that's then the beginning of a potential death spiral. And then that's how you can sort of see the end of the party. So I don't think it's the case that you have this sort of fixed election in 5 years. There could be an election in 6 months, right? If things sort of go a certain way. So the Labour majority is on paper very, very large, but it's extremely thin and weak because a lot of the MPs who sort of came in the 2024 election are not in a particularly sense loyal to Starmer. They're not even necessarily that loyal to the Labour Party. So for the first time since the 80s, sort of I mentioned that you had this SDP, there's the chance for people to win elections on the left and not do it within Labour. So I think there is a sort of growing sense of urgency within the Labour Party that if you don't get your hands around the scandal one way or another, either sticking with Starmer and sort of crushing any mention of sort of rebellion, or getting rid of him, replacing him, even if it's with a sort of an interim Ed Miliband style figure, things sort of could get much, much worse. So I think one interesting sort of example comes from the right, who face a similar situation. So the Tories in the 2000s, it looked like sort of New Labour, which Mandelson was involved in, looked like it sort of might rule forever. The Tories had lost 2 straight elections and they were polling very, very sort of low. They eventually sort of brought back in one of their sort of an old, very senior minister to sort of lead them as this sort of interim period while they got ready for sort of the new generation under David Cameron. But they had to do that. They had to get rid of a weak existing leader because the concern was if they didn't and they sort of kept waiting, even though there were years at that point till the next election, that you essentially lose the possibility of looking like a government in waiting, which sort of the party sort of needs to do. When you're actually in government, right, in theory, this is meant to be much easier because you can just pass laws, right? So you can just do stuff, and then that will kind of generate interest. But at the moment, they're so paralyzed by this scandal, and the scandal is so personal to Starmer, even if it seems very small, even if it's objectively very small, it is paralyzing his ability to govern.
Sure.
And if the governing party loses that ability to govern, you're basically like just a sitting duck, sort of waiting to be well, not to mix my metaphors, but waiting to be served up like a turkey for Thanksgiving. So essentially, somebody has to do something. The question is, will that something come from Starmer, or will it go against him?
Makes sense. Makes sense.
So moving on from British politics entirely to another topic, something that we were discussing last time that has sort of seen a lot of development in the week since is what's going on in Iran and the Strait of Hormuz, where they're, picking up on Jan's point about boats moving through a certain area, there's been a lot of boat movement. Not all of it has been successful. So today we heard that 2 boats have been seized by the Iranians, even after the Strait of Hormuz was sort of believed to be open. Clearly, the boats sailing through believed it to be open. So what is going on there, and when can we expect to see the strait actually open up, in the sense that you can put oil through it and expect it to get it out the other side?
Not soon.
Specific,
we love it.
What do we think about those claims of mines? This is where I think there's a lot of uncertainty. You think this is true? are there actually, 20 to 100 mines that Iran managed to actually lay in the Strait? Is that real? Is that a bluff? Like, how would we know? Do you think the U.S. is confident that this is true? Like, that's a big open question.
I think there's also a big question of, in general, trust and whether oil companies and shipment companies are going to believe that the strait is open and safe just because Iran or the US claims it is. So for example, we have the example of the, what is still currently happening in the Red Sea with the Suez Canal. So there has been a few attacks from the Houthi on vessels that were transiting through the Red Sea on their way to the Suez Canal, and a few attacks were very effective in convincing everyone that that passage was completely not safe. So, but this is the major point of terrorism. It's like, you don't need to have a constant barrage of attacks. You just need to say you have, like, I don't know, a 5% chance of being hit in an attack or something, and everyone stays away from the area because it's not economically viable to take the risk. But of course, the Hormuz Strait is a completely different thing because it's not shipments of stuff, of products and goods that passes through there, but it's mostly oil. So it's something completely different. But I still think that the perception of safety will play a major role, because as long as there is no guarantee that there's going to be a safe passage, many will just refrain from moving through there and take the smallest possible risk.
I think that's very true. I was also quite shocked today by the video of this flotilla. I think this was taken by satellite, or sort of possibly by overhead planes, of about 20 to 25 small Iranian craft moving through the strait. And I was amazed that firstly they were able to move so many boats and not have them all immediately annihilated, and B, that they were sort of doing it so openly. I think the fact that they're able to kind of do that, even if they can't sort of directly engage any ships, strongly raises the chance of the mines being real. Now, do the mines work? Are they actually super easy to remove? Whatever. I couldn't say. But I think the fact they're still able to move boats in the strait definitely raises the chance they're able to like meaningfully block it with these area denial weapons.
Yeah.
I don't have very strong views on all of that right now. At least nothing different from last week. I'm really unsure about the mines, to answer Ben's question, and not even unsure in a 50-50 way. It's just I just don't know what to believe on that. And
Yeah.
we can't even make a forecasting question about that, because how would you operationalize that? What I do believe, however, is that things going back to normal is far away. Even on the logistics side, this is going to be very difficult to bring back to business as usual, in my opinion.
Yeah. I did a little digging. It looks like there's at least 3 sources that claim that U.S. intelligence has reported there to be mines in the strait. Iran denies this, but the New York Times and the Washington Post have reported that this is indeed a thing that the Pentagon believes to happen. And then they also seem to think it would take many months to remove these mines, and that would only happen once the war. It's not like they're going to risk sending in these ships, which I think are actually perhaps like the equipment you need to do this isn't necessarily even in that arena. Like, it could be on the other side of the world, and so that could take a long time. Maybe a good way to like operationalize this is like, will the U.S. or will someone confirm that they have been removing mines at some point, like maybe many months down the line or a year from now? Like, will there be confirmation that mines had been removed? That's maybe a good proxy for some question on like, are there even mines in the strait? How are they like serious?
I always think on the question of whether, like, when Iran sort of denies the mines being there, I think one effect of sort of the fragmentation of the government, as the central government was essentially like all wiped out, is what does it mean for Iran to say that, right? Like,
Yeah.
there could be some like naval station commander who decided to be like, we've got 6 mines, use them or lose them, send the boys out, get them in the strait. And so it's kind of like, there's no like single authority other than like a naval mine sort of sweeper ship that can actually declare whether or not the mines are there for sure.
Yeah, because when the Iranians, the one who said they were going to put mines in the first place, so now denying it is a bit weird. Right? On the demining stuff, my understanding is that so everyone knows the US has been basically sending to the trash their demining bots. Uh, I think in Europe we have a lot of them, especially France. Actually, my understanding is that we have a lot of bots for that, but basically we're not going to intervene until everything is at least back to some kind of normalcy. So not soon.
Hmm. So, there's all of these geopolitical slop posts you can find on Substack or Twitter that are talking about like oil prices have gone up from the Straits, but now there's all this stuff about fertilizer, helium shortages on chip supply chains, other niche products that kind of come out of the Persian Gulf. Um, there were people sort of talking in apocalyptic terms about global farming. I think especially maybe in the global south, I could or no, I think northern hemisphere farming. This is around the time they would like need fertilizer, and if they don't have it,
Yeah.
right, if supply chains are disrupted, that could be very bad for farming yields. And yet, most of the mainstream reporting on this has kind of treated it as like a peripheral thing. Do people have any strong opinions on that? Like, will we see some large scale ramifications in the like farm in like in global agriculture?
So I think in some ways it's a little bit tricky because some of those claims remind me of some of the AI doom claims, because they say that all this stuff is like in the future, right? Because the deliveries that we're currently receiving are ones that left the Strait of Hormuz, kind of over 2 months ago, and so we'll see nothing, and then suddenly everything will collapse because then suddenly, basically one day, the deliveries stop arriving. It's the end of fertilizer production. It's the end of food, and it seems like there absolutely could be a lot of truth in that, right? Because like you can monitor the stockpiles, you can see the ships, and so they got the oil, and it seems to kind of make sense. I think there's maybe two issues. So I think one is that there's very, very likely to be lots of A, sort of private stockpiles, and B, sort of semi-declared government stockpiles that are not necessarily like on the books in the same way. So I think a great example of this is like Australia, because in some ways, right, they have like loads of natural resources, but they also sometimes like they lack refining capacity for both for sort of petroleum and then some of the fertilizer production. But then actually, it turns out that also like a lot of the very big ag companies in Australia have like enormous fertilizer stockpiles. But like those numbers are not like always public information. There's some, I think, debate over like how well categorized they are. So I think it's kind of very hard to say how long those stockpiles can last, what kind of substitution you can expect to see. Obviously, with fertilizer, in some ways, substitution is kind of tricky because there are like very specific nutrients you need, but there are a bunch of different ways to get those to the plants. I think in general, some of those apocalyptic claims are relatively overblown because I think they sort of underestimate how much A, substitution you can do, and B, how like relatively quickly outside of the strait you can move these different stockpiles to where they're needed. I think it is also true that basically petroleum products are feedstock for everything else. There are pretty hard limits on what you can do once those start to run out. I think the big gap is the timelines. I don't think it's true that like in 2026 we're going to see massive food shortages. I think at the same time it is true that if the strait never comes back online, we're going to see a permanent shift to higher prices.
Okay, Nicolo.
So no, I just wanted to say that the supply chains are incredibly weird because, for example, if you think what happened with COVID, we had this kind of situation where people were spending a little bit more time at home than usual, and then immediately the entire supply chain of toilet paper collapsed because there was this difference between the kind of toilet paper that you buy for the home and the kind of toilet paper you buy for the office, and these are two completely different supply chains. So just created a massive impact on that's not massive, but immediately visible effect on the life of people just from something that nobody ever thinks about. So I think that there is some supply chain risk, but I also believe that whenever there's this kind of systemic risk of regarding cultivation agriculture, it's it's usually addressed immediately. So if there's some kind of emergency, there's like hands raised immediately, like we have seen with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And Ukraine has always been called something like the granary of Europe, because they produce a lot of agricultural products for the whole of Europe. And there was this huge concern about how food would move out of Ukraine and into the rest of the world. So whenever there's this kind of issue, there's a fear that agricultural products and food will not be available anytime soon. There's immediately some kind of alarm, because countries are well aware of where their systemic risks are.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So I think something else we wanted to discuss today was a bit more on the inside baseball front of forecasting and AI. Would somebody like to introduce what Mantic is and what role it plays in the forecasting community? Perhaps Ben is best placed to explain this.
Sure. So Mantic is a company working on developing an AI forecasting bot, or maybe a set of tools around that bot that lets you leverage AI's ability to forecast. They've been competing on Metaculus tournaments for some time to kind of showcase their technology. And now I think they're launching a tournament to try to find questions and have people forecasting these questions that would have the most divergence between what the AI forecasts and what the aggregated humans forecast. So, like a question where the AI thinks something is 70% likely to happen and the humans think it's 30% likely to happen. Things
Well,
like that.
as I understand it, it's actually, they are also looking at the divergence between forecasting systems. So it's not only humans and bots, but I think they're looking at the entire spectrum of divergence.
Okay. Yeah, that
I
could be
think.
true.
I'm not 100% sure, but I think that's what they're doing.
Yeah, and so I think we thought it would be interesting to discuss.
Can you repeat that, Nicolo, please? Sorry, I missed that. Can you repeat that, please?
Yeah, so I think that what they're doing is that you have to create a question, and then the question goes live after a delay, which is something like an hour, and then there are the AI systems that have 1 hour to forecast that question, and at the end of the hour they immediately score your question for how much divergence is in the individual prediction, so how much the bots are giving different forecasts.
Yeah, that was my understanding too. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that was my understanding too.
I think that initially you explained it in a way that I also understand what Ben was saying, and that was also my initial understanding. But then when looking at the way the platform functions, I think I got that it's mainly about bots and LLMs, and I think they're using humans to make some kind of comparison, some kind of benchmark to understand if humans are less susceptible to that kind of noise.
Yeah, so I didn't even realize there were humans.
I think there are humans. I'm not 100% sure about that, because it's been a little bit confusing, I think. But so I'm participating as a question writer, and I think also Jan is participating as a question writer. Ben, are you participating, Joshua?
I may be participating in a different capacity.
I'm probably not participating. Although I definitely am intrigued by the idea that you could perhaps sort of train these bots on the Metaculus comment section so well you would no longer know if they were human or AI, and that you would sort of be able to have a kind of similar quality commentary regardless of whether it was bot or man.
Or if it's well written, it's usually bots, because humans, they have high quality content, but poor quality way to output that content. So let me ask you, Joshua, since you're the only one not participating, let's make an example. So what do you think would be a question in which bots would produce predictions that are divergent from one another? So which type of question, which context, which kind of topic do you think would confuse the most LLMs? Because I think it's about trying to understand what causes one to predict that something is highly likely versus something that someone predicting that it's not likely at all. How would you reason through that kind of problem?
So straight out the gate, I would suspect it's probably not to do with like ultra complicated reasoning itself. It's almost certainly to do with like the sources that it like reads in, and sort of like the the post-training data, as it were, that it's kind of dealing with. So I think like an example would be, so like we were discussing sort of Starmer earlier, right? So if like the first article that the bot comes across, because the way that it say like words its initial question on Google is one from say like a party publication like Labor List, it will probably take like a very inside baseball approach. So it will be thinking exclusively in terms of, like say like the personalities in the cabinet or sort of some of like the various commentators. Whereas if the first one it comes across is like the NY Times report or like a BBC report or something, then I think it's much more likely to think in terms of polling, also like election dates, like more structural factors. So I suspect it would be ones where you can essentially have like different information ecosystems that the bots can kind of get like trapped in or sort of like circle in, and then you kind of like particularly completely different ideas. So I think something where like that couldn't happen would be like say the outcome of like a football game or like who's going to win the league or something like that, because there you just like have like these relatively simple objective betting markets. There are like clear favorites. Even if like you're going to take a contrarian approach, you know it's a contrarian one. So it'd be like relatively unlikely for the bots to do that. So I think it's something where like there's ambiguity over like what the outcomes kind of like could even be and sort of the inputs going in there. So yeah, I guess if I like put it in like what kind of question, I think it'll be ones where there's some kind of vagueness. There's sort of like there's some slightly harder to find input, like what is your base rate? What are the comparative cases? That should be like unclear in some sense.
I think you hit upon one of the major themes, because I think many people I talk with about this kind of competition agree that there's this fact that LLMs have a knowledge cutoff that I think it's for most models is at the beginning of 2025, and maybe just OpenAI GPT 5.4 is like August 2025 or something, and that's what the model knows. Let's say as a fact, doesn't need to learn it to learn more than that. So after that cutoff, all the information the model will get is from reading the news, accessing the web in some way, and it's interesting to note that there's some kind of issue that happens when low likelihood events have happened since the cutoff. So examples would be the kidnapping of, let's say, removal of Maduro, or the beginning of the war in Iran, or the Starmer situation, because it emerged later than the beginning of 2025. So in these kind of situations, the model has a fixed knowledge about what happened before, and it's pretty sure that some things are unlikely to happen from that point onwards. So whenever there's this kind of shock and it needs to factor in that shock to predict that question, it may cause some confusion, mostly because it doesn't know as a fact that that event happened. It's not in his past knowledge, but it's something that just reads from the news. So whenever the model fails to gather the news that would allow it to make the correct prediction, or read the news and fails to correlate the information with its prior knowledge, then there's an opportunity to create some kind of confusion and have the model make some weird predictions that are unexpected.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I guess one thing I'd be interested to see is whether that's something that you can kind of deal with, that will change with like the next level of models, right? In the same way that like when you introduce chain of thought reasoning, also like a bunch of sort of step changes in AI, you saw these very different responses to these kinds of questions. I'd be interested to know whether like that's something we can expect again in the next 12 months, or like the future of Mantic bots is just sort of incremental improvements, but you'll still see these big gaps when you get ambiguities.
Yeah. I think there's also like there's a class of things. If you look at kind of what current AI systems maybe are bad at, but are on the cusp of getting better at, such that maybe certain AI systems that are better at forecasting might get it and others won't. There's like a lot of things that maybe fall into the realm of like maybe what humans would describe as optical illusions. So like things where a certain model, if you go back far enough, right? How many R's are in the word strawberry? Well, you could imagine making a forecasting question like how many of this letter will be in the title of the next executive order, or something like this, where like it might be unable to go and figure that out or parse it or get confused. And that's like kind of an old timey example. But there's still things like that where certain AI models struggle in ways that are unintuitive, and so maybe like one model might get that in the question and others aren't or
I think
wouldn't.
my ideal objective in this kind of competition would be to find one question that is for some reason incredibly simple for a human being, but also incredibly important for for the economy or for society in some way, and then that bots struggle to answer that question properly. So but I still need to think about that, because the tournament has just begun. But I think there are a few opportunities, because as Ben said, there's this kind of weird scenarios where there are human rules to things that AI systems fail to understand properly, and fail to in some way translate into probability, or into making a proper model of the world that is able to predict future events.
Yeah.
And with that, shall we move on to our weekly game of Predictal?
Sure, let's bring up the Predictal.
Let's go.
Okay, today I'll read off the 5 markets. We're going to rank them from highest probability to lowest probability. So we have 2 from the ACX tournament. These are like questions that have been ported from the ACX tournament Metaculus into Manifold. One is, will Netanyahu cease to be prime minister of Israel this year? And the second is, will the U.S. enact an AI safety federal statute or executive order this year? So those are 2 of the questions. The third is, will the U.S. average gas price reach $4.30 this month? So within the next 8 days. The fourth is, will Trump invoke the Insurrection Act during his second term? So by January 2029. And the final one is, will Tulsi Gabbard leave the Trump cabinet this year? I can tell this is going to be tougher than last week's.
Yeah, basically all of these are very low.
To start off with the Netanyahu one, I think in some ways it's interesting to think of like Netanyahu almost as like the anti-Starmer, in like he came in sort of with a reputation for being this like kind of crazy guy, and then he just sort of like seems to like win and win and win, even as like all these catastrophes kind of mount up. Politically, he just sort of seems to kind of lock in. At the same time, he has managed to make it to the final year where he has to have an election, right? So there are all these early Israeli elections, but even if it's not an early one, I believe it's October when like the final date is, they can have one. So he will actually have to go back to the polls, which seems to inject a bigger risk than in previous sort of ACX years, where I know continually people have overestimated the chance of him going.
So on this one, the election is in October, I think, and then things can just drag on.
Yeah.
So even if he lost, it's not that likely that he will be removed in 2026. So it's I can see that being high. Well, I already kind of know what is the percent of the community, but at the same time, it's so obvious that it's going to be low. Then I guess the gas price is not very high too, because in my understanding it was around 4.
Yeah, this is where it's
Yeah,
like
it's
almost like you're
4,
forecasting what
4.1.
the current gas prices are.
yeah.
What do we
Yeah,
think
but
the U.S. gas price
the
is?
issue is that this ends like in a week, so I'm not
Yeah.
sure that like a 0.3 increase in a week is that likely. Well, it's
likely.
certainly more likely than many other things in the list, but
It must
I
be
think the
4
main
or
issue is that it's a
4.1.
short-term question.
Yeah, let's say maybe because gas prices also move. Average U.S. gas prices are kind of a lagging indicator. You know, it's slow moving. There's some momentum there, or inertia maybe. So maybe let's say I would say 10% on that question, maybe 15%. What do we think for Netanyahu? I think it's around 30% that he'll be out this year, maybe a little lower.
30.
What do you think?
I was closer to 15 on that one. At least that's what I think the community is around.
On Metaculus, but these are on Manifold. So
but
there's also
it would...
discount rate considerations, maybe a little higher.
Okay.
Maybe 25. I don't know. Okay, so then we have the other one. So will Tulsi Gabbard leave the Trump cabinet this year? I think that's high.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting, right? So I think I can see there's a lot of a case for it being high. I think the flip side is, arguably, all the events that you would have thought would make her leave the cabinet have already happened, and she's still there, right? Like, literal war with Iran. Like, literally going
Like
to
Starmer.
war for Israel with Iran, right? And, like, she didn't leave the cabinet. Like, if there was, like, a bigger anti-Gabbard issue than that, like, I just can't imagine what it would be. And yet she hasn't gone.
So the rumor mill is that Trump has several cabinet members he would like to remove right now, and they're trying to kind of negotiate that behind the scenes. So you saw with the labor secretary, Lori Chavez de Raymer, was just removed, but that, like, the market had known for months. Like, it was priced at like 80% that she's going to remove this year for like a couple months now, just because the scandals were like so bad. They couldn't see it, her not getting around to being removed. With Gap, there was no scandal. It's just like ideological misalignment. I would buy the no on this market. In fact, I have bought the no on this market. But I still think it's going to be high. I think it's probably around 60%. That's my guess. I think it's overpriced, but
Yeah, I would have said something around 50, but I do agree. I think like there's obviously also like clearly high risk of Trump just getting like very annoyed with her, like constantly, I know, trying to like be a drag on these things and just being like, just like get out of here.
yeah. Okay, so then we're left with, but that's above the other two, regardless.
Yeah, sure.
Then we have the will Trump invoke the Insurrection Act during a second term? And will the U.S. enact an AI safety federal statute or executive order this year? There was already one executive order that mentioned AI kind of recently that was like, I think, on the cusp, but like not really meeting this criteria. So it didn't resolve yes already.
I think the tricky thing with the AI safety one is that like an AI safety titled bill can contain a lot of different things within it, and like obviously one that like comes under that title can in fact be an AI accelerationist bill. It sort of depends on who's leading it. The reason I would be very skeptical of any of them passing this year is that I think that first you have like all these cross-party divisions on this. Like there's a bunch of like anti-AI Republicans and there's a bunch of like more pro-tech Democrats, and it just seems like very, very hard that before the election you're going to be able to like build a coalition that goes either way on this one. My guess is both sides are going to want to gamble on having a more favorable coalition after the election and then go hard on whatever they want in a bill.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a somewhat similar question on the run forecasting initiative toward the end of last year, and it was about whether there was going to be some kind of federal law about AI in the US. And I think there were some interesting discussions there because it's the type of scenario that is extremely nuanced because you have, for example, yes, you may have the completely anti-regulation Trump that doesn't want any kind of regulation about that, but then one kind of incident happens when there's a minor involved or some kind of huge safety problem, and there's some kind of rule that is made specifically to patch that issue, and that would probably still count. So it really depends on what's the spirit of the question for this kind of scenario, for these kind of questions. Also, I think that towards the end of last year, there was some kind of announcement from the White House. Maybe it wasn't an executive order or something, but there was an indication that there was an intention to create a federal framework to work with AI systems, and that would likely try to address the safety issues as well. So I don't know if that's likely during 2026, but I know that the process has been ongoing since at least the end of last year. So that's something that has to be factored in.
We have 8 months left, which is a long time in the AI world.
I think
but
also
it's
like
a very short time in the legislation system.
Yeah.
I think the elephant in the room is the recent conflict with Anthropic, because I think that had sort of coded in a very partisan way, even though arguably the issues are not themselves inherently partisan. And I think part of that means that sort of any Trump loyalist sponsored bill will have to tackle this issue of like what the AI labs are allowed to do like unilaterally in interactions with government. And now weirdly the Democrats have become like polarized in favor of an AI lab, even the ones who are like kind of skeptical of AI. And I think that introduces like quite a specific like legislative issue, because like they're going to want to talk about like the DoD and like all these things which maybe 2 months ago were a bit more nebulous and now on the top of everyone's mind. Like a lot of the players are now like quite famous. And again, my suspicion would be that would again just like drop the probability of anything being agreed before the election.
At the same time, on the Trump administration thing with Anthropic, they are now asking like banks and other systems to actually get Claude into everything and try Claude Code, and so just weird stuff all around. But it's to be expected, I guess, from Turpland.
They're in talks to get access to Mythos, so we'll see. Also, I will say this is federal statute or executive order requires no act of Congress. The executive order is unilateral. Trump could just decide to do it one day, and federal statute could be, going through the rules-based processes in various agencies. So yeah, my guess on this, maybe we should all just say a number. My guess on this is maybe like 30%.
Yeah, and another
Sounds reasonable.
another angle to this question is that it's very easy to think that rules only apply to the to American issues and US issues, but there's a huge factor that is like China and everything that is happening with AI abroad. So there is an opportunity that some specific law or executive order would be made to avoid some kind of cooperation with China, or maybe there would be some the requirement to heighten the security of a company to avoid any kind of interference. So maybe they will need to be audited or something. So that would also count somewhat as AI safety, and it's probably something that is more likely to happen. So it wouldn't be reactive to AI as a threat per se, but as the possibility that AI is stolen or is in some way there is some interference from abroad.
So just bringing it back to the ranking, I guess we have our first real clash, this versus Netanyahu, right? Because we were saying both were around like 30%. Do we want to drop
Yeah.
one to a 25 or raise one to a 35?
Netanyahu is lower. Netanyahu is lower.
Okay. Yeah,
I
I
agree.
agree with that. I think
Strongly
probably a
felt.
couple percentage. It's gonna be close though.
And
And then we're putting gas prices at the bottom, right? That's the lowest.
yeah.
We still have insurrection.
What about the Insurrection Act? I'm a bit skeptical on that one, but people seem to believe that he is going to use it, and he has said at several occasions that he will use it.
Yeah. It was close in Minnesota, probably. I mean, betting markets seem to think it could have happened then. There's still a few years left. Again, it could happen in the
Yeah.
midterms or during the federal election, 2028. It doesn't even necessarily have to be like a big deal. He could say like, I'm invoking the Insurrection Act in Detroit because there's like a riot there. I don't know. No
Well,
offense.
that's the thing. We actually don't know what the resolution criteria is.
Yeah.
Looking like a true forecaster.
Will he invoke it? Will he invoke the Insurrection Act?
Yeah.
I think it's probably higher than the other two, though. I would have to guess maybe 40, 50%. But it could have
Yeah, I
dropped.
agree.
It could have dropped a lot after Minnesota kind of didn't happen.
I also think it's around there, like 40, something like that. Yeah.
Okay, so we have our ranking then. That's Tulsi, insurrection, AI safety, Netanyahu, gas prices. Lock it in?
I'm happy
Okay,
with
sounds
that.
good.
Let's see. We switched two of them. We got three of them right. It was Netanyahu and the AI safety. So we're going to switch these and then let's see. And there we have it. Okay, so AI safety is only at 20%. I was too high on that probably.
33% on Netanyahu.
I
Wow.
think it's highly dependent on the resolution criteria, because if there's some kind of very niche executive order that addresses some very small part of AI safety, that probably would still count, but without reading the resolution criteria, it's a bit vague.
Metaculus is at 14% on the AI safety federal statute. That seems low to me. It's so unilateral. Like an agency head could push for this. I mean, it's also possible they do this without a formal rules-making process, I think. It says law or executive order, but federal statute can include a lot of other things. I don't know. Who can say?
Netanyahu is at 25%. Okay.
On
On
Metaculus.
Metaculus. Yeah. So that's higher than I believed. Okay.
We found Jan's big issue. We're going to have to check back in on this every week and monitor the state of the Netanyahu administration.
Please no. Weekly Netanyahu segment. Okay.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for another great episode, guys. I hope you all enjoyed that out there. And we will see you all next week. Thank you very much.
See ya.
See ya.
Thank you. See you. Bye-bye.